Everything's fine, nothing's broken. Truly, if there's one thing that Norse mythology teaches us, is that when you encounter adversity, hit it. Indeed, hitting things with a hammer is a fairly common sort of trope. If you imagine that MAGFest represents a timeline, so, in Norse mythology, there are these things called Jotnar, which are occasionally mistranslated as giants or trolls, and they're largely responsible for everything bad. I don't know what Jotnar I angered, what trolls I have displeased, but clearly they get involved with technical things. Yes, opening Microsoft Edge is never really where I think to go. Microsoft Edge. Most common use, downloading Chrome. Ooh, that looks like a thing I made. Woo! Okay, it's a little smaller than I'm used to, but you know what? I think we can all relate. Okay. Wow, Mike started off with a dirty joke. Okay. Okay. So, yes, Norse mythology and modern video games. I think you can all guess the runic for that one. By the way, if you're curious, those are Anglo-Saxon runes. We'll talk a little bit about those in a moment. But first, let's talk about me, because that's my favorite subject. This is me. I mean, I'm smaller there, but I'm also colder. Actually, it's colder outside than it was when I was at Geysir or Thingfeller. So, I'm a teacher by trade. I'm a mythology dork by choice. I do love mythology, but I do teach English, and I teach English, I teach history, so really mythology is totally, it's one of those things I don't get to teach as much as I'd like to because nobody cares, but we do, and that's awesome. So, I also went to Iceland one time, as you can see from this photographic evidence, and generally speaking, I won't shut up about it. Because it was amazing. Okay, I was only there for like 80 hours, but what an 80 hours. Oh my God. If you can go there and not fall into a volcano, perfect, amazing. Highly recommend, 10 out of 10 except for volcanoes. And that is in fact Geysir, the geyser from which all geysers are named. And Thingvellir, which is the longest running parliament in the world, running at about 1,000 years. Yep, and I'm standing on it. I hope I'm allowed to, because I just admitted to all of you and the internet that I did that. So sorry, Iceland, but it was really cool. I also play video games, so that's a pretty good feather in my cap. And I would like to just apologize now for all of my pronunciations. Norse is difficult, and even though I do have quite a bit of Germanic background, Swedish, Danish, Norwegian, Finnish, Icelandic, these all have different intonations and pronunciations. And I tried to be as uniform as I could with my spellings of things, but I'm just some schmo from New Jersey. All right, enough about me. Let's get into the content warning. It's a little hard to see, but this is Gonzo and Rizzo, and I almost feel like I don't need to read it for you, but I will, which is, well, let me talk about the content warning. Now, the following may be discussed, but I will not discuss in any graphic detail, nor will any of it be shown at all, let alone in graphic detail. But we may discuss violence, dismemberment, murder, human sacrifice, suicide, death, self-harm, mental illness, raiding, pillaging, slavery, and mild spoilers. I have to include this because all of these aren't from the video games. They're from Norse mythology. And therefore, that's scary stuff. Should we be worried about the kids in the audience? No, it's all right. This is culture. And indeed, so if any of this is too much for any... Ooh, I got some lipstick on the microphone there. Sorry. If any of this is too much for any of you, I apologize, but just be aware that I may discuss these things because that is actually part of Norse mythology. It is a brutal and vicious and violent mythology that includes a wide array of things. I am not going to get into any of the graphic details, as I said, but some of them are just simply unavoidable. Human sacrifice was a standard for a very long time for Norse paganism at the time of the Viking Age, as well as much of this other stuff. Cool? Nice. Good enough for me. All right. This is our overview, by the way. By the way, did I tell you that I went to Iceland one time? If you go to Reykjavik, that is the Rainbow Road. I won't be on it, but that is called the Rainbow Road, or the School Guard Crossing is the name of the road. I think. Did somebody just play the Rainbow Road sound? I know. I couldn't help but think of it either. Anyway, but I'm going to talk briefly about the Viking Age because that will give us the context for a lot of this information, the mythological sources from which I draw. Then we'll do Norse myth in brief, very brief, and then the games, and then a couple of honorable mentions. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the Viking Age. This is why I really needed my slide, and I apologize for those of you in the back where this is extremely minute, but sorry. So the Viking Age, what we normally think of as being the Viking Age, started in 793 and generally assumed to be the beginning of the Lindisfarne raid, which is when Vikings from Scandinavia looped to Lindisfarne and raided the monastery there. Now, this had been going on for quite a while, but this was one of those, like, no one, like, we're safe here. No one would ever raid here. They would never be successful. Hey, who's that on the horizon sorts of raids. And so it's generally considered to be the beginning, and then it goes on to 1066, where it's generally assumed to wind down at another battle that is in England. Both of these things take place in the British Isles, have nothing to do with Scandinavia, but we kind of use those as our guidelines. And to be clear, when I say the Viking Age, this is the age in which Scandinavia really dominated the Northern European area and in some Southern European areas in terms of raiding and pillaging and generally showing up and taking things and being involved with politics in a violent sense. But there's no such thing as a Viking-born person, because to Viking means to raid. Like Viking and raiding are almost identical synonyms, almost exact translations. So if you go a Viking, or if you go a Vikinger, you're really just saying that you're going pillaging. That's all you're saying. In the same way that nobody is born a pirate, the other thing I know a lot about and occasionally talk about, because I'm Captain Mike, it's almost the same idea. You become a pirate because you go and do pirate things. You become a Viking because you go Viking and take stuff and occasionally burn things down. Now, for a comparison, oftentimes we have this image in our minds, or I find people think that the Viking Age, it happened like long ago. And so like that's when all of the other long ago things happened, like ancient Greece and Rome and like all that other old stuff. But if you look at this timeline and kind of just trust me because wow, did this turn out small. The Viking Age is this red bar right here. The conversion period for going from Norse paganism to Norse Christianity is also smack dab during that same period. And so we often think of Norse mythology as being synonymous with Vikings, but many Vikings were actually converting to Christianity. And along with that, we have this image of like Christianity showing up and being like, the old gods, boom, they're for losers and lamos. So we're going to kill anybody who opposes us. But most of it was actually just like a quiet political switch. Once the kings started changing over, so too did the people that followed the kings. And so while there were violent conflicts and there were forced conversions, much of it was actually very undramatic. It was sort of like, oh, the king converted. All right, well, put up a church. Whatever, winter's coming, we got stuff to do. I should have looked up the Norwegian for we got stuff to do. But just to throw this into some further relief, we often think of the Viking Age, and especially if you're playing around with the mythologies, because you've got like Greek gods, you've got Roman gods, you've got Norse gods, and they all have a lot of similarities, right? They're all kind of like wacky individual people who are like people with superpowers, right? Well, except the Roman paganism actually stopped like way back here around 400 CE. So like Rome was Christian back when they were sacked by the Norse. So like there's a heavy Christian influence, and we had mentioned Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which I really appreciate in there, that almost everybody you run into is already Christian. The main character and their like village are Norse pagan, but they're kind of the odd ones out, and they should be. Everyone else is like, yeah, we're on the God train, pal. Let's go. And a lot of this comes from like boring stuff like, why do we have kings, and why does he get to be king, and yeah, all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, it's not as dramatic as like, no, I will fight for my beliefs. Most people are like, all right. And indeed, most of the conversions were like, oh, okay, so you've got Jesus is a different kind of a god. Your God is a different kind of a god, but we can still kind of integrate our beliefs. If you're ever kind of bored, try looking up the stuff about Norse Christianity when they first, the descriptions of Jesus on the cross. It is fascinating because he does not do the like martyrdom. He climbs up the cross himself and is like, let's do it. Which is a powerful take on Christianity that maybe a young Mike could have really benefited from. But yeah, it's interesting stuff, different ethics. Okay.
If people want your slides, can they email you for them?
If people want my slides, can they email me? Oh my goodness. Well, I do have my email address on every single slide, although it is very small. But yes, if you want copies of these slides, and a lot of these slides I'm going to go through very quickly because I went kind of whole hog on this one and put an awful lot into it, and we've only got a little less than an hour now. But if you come up to me, I can give you my email address. I have business cards. I will give you my slides. I have an entire separate sheet for notes. I will give you those too. Knowledge is power, and I spread that. All right, this one I'm going to go through very quickly, but this is just a really quick idea of like the kind of areas that we're talking about. So Scandinavia is this area here, which is featured in red. This is the Scandinavian settlement and general getting involved with. So the Scandinavians began to settle across into the British Isles, where we'll get like Senua's sacrifice up here, and we'll talk about it. You see Valhalla down here. But you can see the influence all the way through all of Europe, because this was not a minor incident in history, even though we don't really teach about it in schools. So, yeah. Also, Iceland wasn't populated by anybody before Norse settlers showed up, which is kind of cool because it means that they just kind of showed up and nothing really changed in a lot of ways. Old Icelandic is the closest language to Old Norse, which is otherwise a vanished language. Next slide, please. Okay. Very briefly, I want to talk about runes because I don't think there's any fantasy game in the world that doesn't include runes in some fashion. Some of this you might not like. I mean, you're going to love it. So the word rune just means letter. It's like a character, but it means specifically a letter from a Norse or Germanic, Proto-Germanic language. They can be used for text speak because each rune has its own name. So if you have like the rune, in the same way that you could say like, see you later, and you could use like C and a U. You know what I mean. What am I talking about? Everyone knows what I mean when I say text speak. You can do that with runes, but it was never considered to be like magic. You can't take a rune and make something change because you put a rune on it. In the same way that I can't put an L on someone and make them a loser. Do I need to? But I can put an L on someone and make them a loser, or I can mark something L and another thing R, and you know that means that they are supposed to be on the left and the right, but it doesn't make them left or right. On the other hand, you can string a bunch of runes together and make magic spells, because runes were kind of like magic, because you could write them down and then things knew what they meant, and that's kind of magical when you think about it. You didn't tell any of those people those things. But I did want to briefly bring this up, because a lot of the information that we're pulling from is information that was gathered a couple hundred years after the actual mythology had been told, because the Norse people, the old Norse people had oral traditions. Writing was for nerds, reading was for losers. And so they didn't write anything down. The few runic stuff that we have tends to be carved stuff for this, that, or the other thing. I love this. The earliest one, Proto-Norse, comes out to roughly, I, God guessed, painted this. It's right up there with like, I was here. Gives you an insight. Some of the other earliest runic writing, by the way, includes a startling amount of profanity. Oh, and very briefly, just to make sure that a lot of people are very unhappy, this symbol is called the Vegvisir. There's a whole bunch of symbols like this in the Holt manuscript, which was found in the mid-1800s, in 1860 specifically. It contains a bunch of arcana and like mystic stuff that supposedly was gathered throughout Europe, but there are no attestations of Vegvisir before the 1860s. No use of those runes. So if you see those, they're kind of Germanic, but they are not necessarily Norse. There's no evidence one way or the other. And you're going to hear me say that a lot. There's no evidence one way or the other, because a lot of this information is just gone. Next slide. Ooh, I really should have started my timer. Okay, so my mythological sources, because I apply academic rigor to only the most inappropriate of things. But when I talk about the mythological sources, and this is kind of the tough part, is that you'll notice that I only have 3 things. This is where almost all of it comes from. We have the Poetic Edda, which includes a bunch of different sets of poems, but it's been dated to about 1100 CE. It was discovered only in the mid-1600s, so even this information is fairly new in historical terms. But you'll notice 1100, that's after 1066. That was after the Viking Age ended. And it's kind of like a maybe, and those are just some written down skaldic stories from when monks, Christian monks who were into writing, would ask people like, oh, hey, do you have any cool stories? And they write stuff down. And then we've got Snorri Sturluson, who, if you get into Norse mythology, you will hear that name a lot. A lot. Snorri Sturluson, because he wrote the Prose Edda. He was an Icelandic monk, and he was like, hey, it's been a while since we were all pagan, but those stories were really cool. I don't want those to disappear. And there was kind of a revival where people were like, yeah, those stories were really cool. We should write those down. And he was like, okay. So he gathered a bunch of these stories and wrote them down. And you'll notice both of these things involved Christian monks. Not a single thing is directly from the source. So all of the stuff we have to go through translations, mistranslations, cross-translations, Christian influence, which may or may not exist. We can't even assume that. Maybe they were being really close to the story. And then we have Gesta Danorum, which is from Saxo Grammaticus, which is an awesome name that just means Saxo the learned. And he wrote Gesta Danorum, which is the history of the Danes. And his purpose was to make Denmark seem super awesome. But he tied Norse mythology into the idea that these gods, quote-unquote gods, were actually really powerful people in the past, and they were misremembered as gods. So that's super hard to work together because many of these stories are impossible. But then you have and then he was related to Attila the Hun. That's not a joke, by the way. That's actually part of it. He mentions Attila the Hun. And that was written in the late 1100s, so that's still past the Viking Age. Oh, and again, cleric. A cleric? What is he, casting spells, Mike? Woo. You know, he's one of those priest classes. They get all the healing spells. The additional sources I was using was a Handbook of Norse Mythology by John Lindow, 2001, The Norse Myths, A Guide to Gods and Heroes by Caroline Larrington. Caroline Larrington, by the way, a fantastic source for this. Her translation of the Poetic Edda is also my preferred. And Norse Mythology, The Unofficial Guide by Wolfram, whose name I'm almost certainly mispronouncing, which is a podcast on Spotify, which I cannot recommend enough. It is called Norse Mythology, The Unofficial Guide. Fantastic work, goes through a lot of the stuff step by step, including the parts where he's like, this is what we can pull from this source and what we can pull from this source. His academic rigor, top notch. All right, moving on. Okay, the Norse mythology lightning round, which I will be very lightning on this. Ha ha ha. So the Aesir are like the Norse gods, but more specifically, they're the Norse good guy gods in the sense that they're the ones that we're supposed to like, so to speak. And you've probably heard of this trio, in fact, featured here from the video game Age of Mythology, which was fantastic, but also not a modern one. We've got Odin, son of Bor and Besla. We've got Thor, son of Odin and Jord, and Loki, son of Farbauti and Laufey. In fact, you've often probably heard Loki Laufey's son. By the way, that's super interesting because that means that it's a matriarchal matronym, I suppose it would be. Normally it's patronymic, but there's this whole class thing where you'll find that the Old Norse cultural concept was extremely stratified. Everything was about well, who's better than whom in the sense of who's a higher status, who's from a better family, who in the family is from a better position. It comes up again and again and again, very intense. And so the common sort of consideration is that Loki may have taken his mother's name on the basis that his mother may have been of a higher status. So he wants to be Laufey's son and not Farbauti's son, even though that sounds kind of cool. But also you may notice that, if you can read it, all of these people, none of them are the progeny of two Aesir. Instead, each of them are Odin and Thor, both are products of one Aesir, which would be an Is, and one Jotun. Jotun is often translated as giant, which causes a lot of confusion. And sometimes it's translated as troll or ogre. But a Jotun is, well, we'll get to it. It's at the bottom. But they're not Aesir. And so that kind of causes some The only odd one out is Loki, who is the son of a Jotun, and Laufey is never specified. She's referred to a couple of times as an elf, but a little later we'll get into why that gets problematic. We've got the Vanir, and if you're familiar with Howard's Conan series or the video games, Conan, don't worry, I'm still talking about video games. The Vanir are like a sort of Norse group that is like super tough. But the Vanir are like the gods who are like, yeah, they're those other gods, which introduces some more problems. So are the Aesir like different than the Vanir? They intermarry all the time. Are the Vanir, some people have posited the Vanir were gods of different groups that kind of got integrated. But at the very least, they all seem to be the same like species, if you want to think of it that way. And then you have the Jotnar, or the Jotun is singular, Jotnar plural. They're not actually giants, but that causes problems in translations where they're said to be giant, because we hear giant, we're like, oh yeah, like super big. But the Jotnar are like, they have for one, they clearly get it on with the Aesir. But they're not actually giants, but they're also not specific to any particular form. Many of them are described as just like, they're like people. But then some of them are like crazy weird. Like Ymir was supposed to be the Jotun at the beginning of time, and he was big enough to make the whole world because the whole world is made out of his body. Okay, moving on. Whew. Trolls. Hey, video game stuff. Man, okay, a little hard to see, but we've got Witcher 3: The Wild Hunt, which, by the way, is fantastic. It's got a great pastiche of all kinds of like German folklore. And Skyrim. Like, what would I even say? But trolls. Trolls are kind of a complicated word because we often get a lot of things that translate to trolls, but that includes sometimes the Jotnar, sometimes the word troll, and sometimes the word thurs, which is like boogeyman or ogre or troll. But it's always used in like a scary bad guy term. No trolls are good guys, because if they were good guys, we would not call them trolls. They do not typically, in Norse mythology, hang out on a forum, but times change. But they're also not a species. They're more like a monster, like that term, monster. The Draugr, because where would video games be without skeletons wandering about? Draugr show up in the Icelandic sagas later on, but they're not really part of Norse mythology proper. But they show up so frequently, how could I not mention it? Again, Skyrim. And then the Nine Realms. This is a point of some odd contention because there are lists of what the Nine Realms are, but as we'll find out, some of those realms are the same places. And the original text in Völuspá, Cirrus's prophecy, is, I remember 9 worlds, I remember 9 giant women, which is where the idea of the 9 worlds most frequently comes from. And it's not, I remember the 9 worlds, but just I remember 9 worlds. Maybe there's more. Maybe she remembers 9 of them. Maybe worlds is supposed to mean like time periods. I don't know. There's no real evidence to it. But it is interesting that the number 9 shows up in Norse mythology extremely frequently whenever somebody needs a number between 3 and infinite. So it's been posited maybe she means, I remember a lot of worlds. I remember a lot of giant women. Or Jotnar. Somebody say snoo-snoo? I would remember that. And our next one is already up, Northgard, fantastic. So let's, okay, we've got the basics, right? Anybody have any questions about the Norse mythology part, the lightning round? Everybody got it? PhDs in Norse mythology? All right, let's see what people did right and what people did wrong. By the way, just to be clear, Norse mythology was an evolving oral tradition. There really isn't much of a right or a wrong in many cases. And even what I might say, this is what we find in this thing, that might have been different 100 years earlier or 100 miles to the west or east. So we do have to keep that in mind. But what I am looking for particularly is the stuff that video game designers bring in, and the only time that I find myself being very harsh and critical is when a video game claims to have gotten it right. Because if you're going to claim this is exactly what it was, that's when the academics rub their hands together and say, yes, I can do a MAGFest panel about that. Okay, but our first game is Northgard, which is from 2018. It's Shiro Games. It's a fun little game. It's sort of like a, it's somewhere between a colony simulator and like a tile expansion game where you take over different areas. And it's inspired by Norse mythology. So it already gets kind of like an, okay, I'll be nice to you kind of vote for me. It does feature Draugr, which you'll hear me say a lot. It features the Jotnar as friend or foe, which I find interesting. And they do have a Jotun picture here. Now, they are big and overly muscly, but I kind of like that it presents them as being something that could be your friend or could be your enemy. And there are a number of stories of the Aesir working with Jotnar. Yeah, class so complicated, I actually had to have a separate note sheet. But I kind of like that idea. It includes fallen Valkyries, which are corrupted by Helheim. And we'll talk more about Helheim a little bit later in a game that is obviously going to be Hellblade 2, Senua's Sacrifice. Spoiler alert. I told you there'd be mild spoilers. But fallen Valkyries, this was never really a thing. The Valkyries were warrior women who would determine which souls went to Valhalla, and which souls didn't, and they would occasionally give victory to one side or the other in Odin's stead, and sometimes they even gave it to the wrong group. There's one story where a Valkyrie thought a guy was super hot, so she was like, I want him to win. And then Odin was like, you shouldn't have done that. And she was like, but he was hot. What I like about mythology is that it's timeless. Also, in Norse mythology, the corrupted by is kind of strange because Helheim isn't really a corrupting force. It's the afterlife. I mean, I guess that's kind of corrupting because it's supposed to be kind of boring, but whatever. But I kind of wanted to get in here. It also includes the Myrkalfar. Oh, my God. I'm going to mess this up a lot. The Myrkalfar, which you might hear more frequently as the Svartalfar, obviously, and dwarves. Now, to be clear, Myrkalfar, which are over there. Next slide, please. Means shadow elf. Mirk elf. Murky is where we get the word murky from the word mirk. Shadowy. I told you I did a lot. And then Schwarz is the word where German eventually gets Schwarz, meaning black. So it's either shadow elves or black elves. And if anybody played Dungeons and Dragons, if you've heard of that? Yep. The dark elves. Yeah. And so you've got basically the light elves and the black elves. And the light elf is kind of a later thing. If anybody's ever heard of the Brothers Grimm, yeah, Jacob Grimm, who did a lot of research into this kind of stuff, unsurprisingly, was like, hey, maybe this light elf thing is only because you'd have elves and then you'd have dark elves, and then that would confuse people. So they started like emphasizing the light elf thing, which is kind of interesting. But what's weird is that it has Myrkalfar or Svartalfar and dwarves, but they may be the same people. Whoa. Blown minds. So here's the deal. Perhaps I think the best example here is, you know Loki, played by Tom Hiddleston. No, not the Marvel Loki. Who is, by the way, Thor's uncle, because he and Odin are blood brothers, obviously, right? You remember that, right? So anyway, in the story where Loki cuts off Sif's hair, Sif being Thor's wife, and then gets in a lot of trouble for it, he's like, oh, no, don't worry, I can fix this. I'm going to go to the dwarves, and they're going to make some new hair, because, I mean, we've all had that happen, right? We get a bad haircut, and we're like, where's the dwarves? But he says to Thor, he's like, because Thor's, of course, once again caught him, and he's about to break every bone in his body. And Loki's like, hey, it's cool, bro. I mean, cousin? No, nephew? Whatever you are. That's how he talks. I'm going to go down to the dwarves, and they're going to make even better hair like they do, if you let me go. And Thor is like, yeah, that makes sense. No, really. And so Loki goes off. But the thing is that, like, immediately Loki says that he's going to go to the dwarves, and he goes off to Svartalfheimr, or Dark Elf Land. Like, that's his immediate thing. And then he talks to two dwarves. So it's not like he said one thing and then did a different thing. But so there's a lot of evidence, and as you go through it, it does seem like the only time there are dark elves, they are in the same places that dwarves lives, and dwarves live in the same places as them. So there's a lot of contention that maybe these are actually just different terms for the same thing. Speaking of which, elves, maybe they're gods, maybe they're their own things. It's really hard to tell. Some of the gods are referred to as elves half the time, and sometimes groups that involve gods and also their servants are referred to as the Aesir and the Elfar. So it's the elves, the gods and the elves. There's a ton of Norse mythology where things are like, whatever. And part of that is because of the oral tradition. Maybe who you're telling the story to gets misremembered, gets changed for different parties. It's a good time. But the at any rate, the elves are actually just perfectly normal people. The dwarves are also perfectly normal people, except that they always seem to live underground because Fraldolfhelmr is always described as being underground. And they were originally described as being maggots in Ymir's rotting corpse. Ymir became the earth, and then they were maggots that were turned into people, and then they just kept living underground for whatever reason. And the only thing that really is particular to them, they are assumed to be normal size. They can do all the same things that normal sized people do, and when they use something and give it to someone else, it's all normal sized. So they're not short. There's no description of beards, but they are Norse, so probably. But they make magic items. That's like their big deal. The Aesir never really have their own magic powers, but they often have magic items that the dwarves have made and given to them. No explanation is given why the dwarves are always like trying to get on the Aesir's good side, but maybe it's just good policy. Also, no lady dwarves are mentioned. It's the beards. All right, Valheim. So, did somebody say, "Oh, thank God"? Yes, we're going to talk about Valheim now. So Valheim, 2021, Iron Gate Studios. It's still early access, but honestly, it's so good. But it does take place in the supposed 10th realm, which is perfectly fine because maybe there's more than 9 realms, who knows? But I actually kind of like that because it means that they're not in a place that's been described in some way because then they can do whatever they want. See? It's clever. It includes a ton of folklore creatures, including Nex, which sent me on an entire rabbit hole. Nixies, Necker. They're all water spirits of all varying kinds, but they all get the same name. Super complicated. In the game, they're just kind of like little lizards. Includes trolls, featured here, and sea serpents, which are pretty cool. Includes a bunch of fantasy creatures, which are entirely just made up from whole cloth. It includes dwarves as both merchants and enemies, and sort of like a neutral party that only attack when attacked. More Draugr, which are kind of hard to see in the lighting, but they're those glowing eyes of those. Also includes feather cloaks, which I thought was a neat inclusion. On a number of occasions in the myths, people put on feather skins, and it makes them into the thing that they were. In fact, this happens a lot with all kinds of animals. Wolf skin, there's a hawk skin, and so forth. And so you put it on, and it turns you into the creature. You don't fly, you become an eagle, or you become a falcon. Yeah, they make all kinds of stuff. I definitely have my notes right in front of me like a responsible person. How dare you suggest otherwise? There we go. Feather cloaks are owned by the goddesses Frey and Frigg. They're just owned. But in both cases, they're lent to Loki in Thrumskvide and Skaldskaparmal. And then the Jotun Suttinger uses one as well to chase after Loki in one of those. So like, there's a lot of times where like you can just put on an animal's skin, and I don't know if they're supposed to be like, but that one's magical, or if you can just, if you skin an animal right, you can just get in its skin. No evidence one way or the other. But it's fun. Also, this is not mythological, but Valheim includes swamp iron, which I didn't know was a real thing. Turns out in Scandinavia, most iron is swamp iron, which is, dead things go into swamps and they die, right? That's just what swamps are because they're level 3. And living things have iron in them, right? Yeah, sure, if you're eating, right? But then when you die in the swamp, the iron in your body eventually comes out of your body as it degrades, and it collects in places in swamps. And I was like, yeah, I was playing Valheim, and in order to get iron in Valheim, mild spoiler, you have to go into these like underground crypts where it's just collected in piles. And I'm like, this is a weird kind of fantasy thing. And then I Googled it, and I was like, oh my God. And 6 hours later, I found out that, yeah, that's how you get iron in Scandinavia. You find it in piles in the swamp. It's not quite as easy as just swinging a pickaxe at it, but I was like, that's crazy. But that's a real thing. It's not mythology. Sorry. Hellblade, Senua's Sacrifice, 2017 by Ninja Theory. This one is kind of an odd one out because this isn't actually about Viking Norse mythology. The main character is a Pict, which means that she's from the Orkneys in northern Scotland, that sort of an area. But the reason that the game has a quote-unquote Viking-Age Norse mythology pastiche is because she was part of a village that was raided by Vikings, and so she's going into the afterlife of the attackers to try to right some wrongs of some mysterious kinds. So I thought it was kind of an interesting choice because this is not her religion. But if you are interested in it, there is an Irish mythology class or panel, whatever, Saturday at 7 p.m. By a woman named Octavia. Actually, is Octavia here? Hey, there you are. So yes, at 7 p.m. there will be an entire thing about It's Irish mythology in Fire Emblem. So much connected. I was like, maybe I should look up some stuff for the Pictish religion, but I ran into two problems. One, there's no remaining information about the Pictish religion specifically, and two, I didn't have enough time to do an entire whole Celtic mythology thing. But yeah, so she basically goes to someone else's afterlife. And then she goes to Helheim, which just means the land of hell. So we've got hell and hell's hall. By the way, you'll notice hell in each case has one L. It's not the same as the Christian hell, but it turns out that those words come from the same place. When the Bible was translated into the closest thing to English at the time, they were using the word hell to mean like afterlife. So if you're ever wondering why those words are so similar, it's not actually a coincidence. So Hel is a person. It's actually one of Loki's kids. Yeah, that's normal. In fact, Loki has 3 kids. One of them is Jormungandr, the World-Serpent, which is the serpent that is so large it encircles all of the world and has to bite its own tail. The other one is, of course, Fenrir, the wolf that heralds Ragnarok. More on him later. And Hel, a woman who is described as being half regular-skinned and half dead-skinned, which is a rough translation. The word that is used is that she's half human, half fair-skinned, and half the same word that is used for the color of corpses. So, half alive-looking, half dead-looking. No description, of course, no detail. So many of these myths, there's no detail at all. It's just like, and then this fantastical thing happened. At one point, Thor raises his goats from the dead after eating them. That's as much description as you get. That thing I just said. And it's like, really? How did that work? And it was like, badly, because somebody ate some of the marrow out of one of the bones, and now one is lame. Any further description? No. It is metal. Look, there's a reason why Scandinavia is the heart of black metal, and why black metal is the heart of Scandinavia. Also, coffee is a big deal there. Anyway, did I mention I was in Iceland one time? Oh my God, the coffee, amazing. Anyway, so yeah, she's described as being those two things. And she is, when the Aesir finally find out that Loki has these 3 kids, they have some mixed results. So Odin has Jormungandr thrown out into the water where it encircles Midgard. Fenrir is inexplicably kept with the Aesir in their home, but then Hel is just like exiled to Hell, which is extremely convenient because it's the name of the location as well, but I guess we get the idea. It's that place, and then it becomes called Hell. And then she becomes in charge of it, but it's not clear, like, so is that like getting a bad job when your manager hates you? Like, you're like, your job is to go hang out over there with the dead people, or did she just show up and was like, well, I guess I'm in charge now because, booyah, I'm the only one who's sort of alive. No explanation. In fact, she gets no characterization at all, which is actually true of a lot of characters in Norse mythology because there's so little to work from. Anyway, you can kind of see here that most of the game follows Senua, who is our Pictish warrior, and then it shows Hel as being kind of like a bridge over an oceany sort of an area, and then it has the classic, here's a foresty area, here's a mountainy area. But the depiction, I thought, kind of got the feeling of Hel, but not the actual description of Hel. because hell itself is sort of like, it's just a place you go to after you die. And some people go to hell, but you may be thinking, but Mike, don't people go to Valhalla? And wasn't there a game named that? Well, sort of. There's a big thing where the question is Valhalla just in hell? Is hell where like all of the bad, like all of the people go, and then the good people get to go to the VIP section called Valhalla? Or do the like later things suggest that if you die in battle or honorably, you get to go to Valhalla, but if you die from some like punk reason like starvation or whatever, you have to go hang out in hell? Yeah, I know. It's really unclear. In fact, a lot of the later sagas don't even mention Valhalla. Like, it's almost like not a thing to them. There are some tracks that suggest that hell is its own place, but there are other tracks that suggest that hell is one place that is connected to all of the other realms. So does each realm have its own hell? Does everybody go to one hell? It's kind of hard to say sometimes. Or, in fact, in general. So yeah, so normally when you go to hell, in case you were ever wondering, there is one time where somebody goes to hell, and that is after Baldur's death. Baldur was the god of looking cool and everyone loving him. That's literally his only trait. That's it. Everybody loved Baldur. And he dies because Loki is sick of everybody thinking he's cool. And to make a very long story shorter, Baldur had a dream, and he dreamt that he died. And then because he had a dream that he died, he went to his mom and was like, "Mom, I had a dream where everybody thought I died." And she thought that was terrible, and everybody else agreed that that was terrible. So the mom went out and got a promise from every single thing in the world that it would not hurt Baldur, to make sure that he would always live forever. And that included things like sickness and metal and rocks and trolls and ugly people. And then and then later it became a game where everyone would try to kill Baldur with things, but of course it didn't work. So like arrows would fly off of him, and like rocks would bounce away from him, and so forth, because nothing would hurt Baldur, because they made a promise. And holding a promise is one of the most important things in Norse culture. Hold your promises. Hold true to your oaths. But Loki didn't really like all that, because he always hates it when other people get like some sort of like fancy thing going on. So he went over to Baldur's blind brother and was like, "Hey, why aren't you throwing anything?" And he was like, "Well, I don't have anything, and also I'm blind, idiot." And so Loki was like, "Oh, don't worry about that. I'm gonna go get you something." So then he transforms into a woman and goes and hangs out with Baldur's mom and is like, "Hey, I can't believe nothing was willing to hurt Baldur." And Baldur's mom was like, "Yeah, I got a promise from everything." And then the handmaiden, who is secretly Loki, is like, "Everything?" And then Baldur's mom is like, "Well, now that you mention it, I didn't get a promise from Mistletoe, because Mistletoe seemed really young at the time, so I didn't bother. Hey, where'd you go?" So Loki went and got Mistletoe, and then made a dart or an arrow or a wand or a spear, depending on your translation, all of which is impossible because mistletoe is not a tree, but here we are. So he gives this mistletoe dart, we'll call it, to Hod, Baldur's blind brother, and Hod throws the dart, and of course it kills Baldur stone dead. Everyone's super bummed out about it, and they're all like being really angry and sad and everything, and they throw Loki out of the party. And Hermodr, who doesn't really do much else, but Hermodr is sent across to find Baldur in the afterlife so that he can be brought back, which is sort of where Senna was kind of heading with this, in case that wasn't painfully obvious. The problem is that when he gets there, Hell has like this whole party laid out, because even in Hell, Baldur's the man, and everyone loves him. And they're like, "Oh, we're super stoked that you're here, dude. We don't mean to be rude, but we're so glad you're dead." Anyway. And Hell says, who, by the way, has no attestations of ever having anybody else get out of the afterlife at any point ever, is like, "Okay, Hermodr, if you can find everything in the creation and say that they weep for Baldur, and actually have them weep for Baldur, then all right, I'll let him go." And so Hermodr's like, "No problem. Everybody loves this dude. Everyone's crying already." Goes and everyone weeps. Now, if you're wondering, how does a stone weep? Snorri Sturluson points out that when you bring a cold rock into a warm room, it weeps. There. Checkmate. However, there was one person who didn't, a Jotun named Thok, which means thanks. There's a lot of suggestion that it's actually Loki in another disguise, once again appearing as a woman. Because later Loki is like, "Hey, you remember when Baldur died? I made sure he couldn't come back." Anyway, so Baldur's Gate dead. Cool? None of that is featured in this game, however, by the way. Senua has her own journey, and it's like this whole like other kind of journey. Nothing to do with that. I just thought you'd like the story. Next slide. Assassin's Creed Valhalla, which is a small title. I don't know. Anybody heard of it? All right. So Assassin's Creed Valhalla. There's a lot in here, and there's a whole section of the game that deals with the myths and so forth, which I got to admit I hated. Now, you might say, Mike, did you hate it because you felt that it wasn't being true to the mythological sources? And I would say, well, it was that too, but mostly those were some of the worst terrain to have to go back and forth and do fetch quests over. Anyway, so in Assassin's Creed Valhalla, it's set in 873 CE, which just means it's like smack in the Viking Age. The myths are encountered as visions and dreams and drug trips, so you can kind of give a little leeway there because depending on what's going on in Eivor, the main character's life, that kind of influences her take on certain things. Sorry, his or her take, because you can choose between them, but I think we all know what I chose. One of the things I noticed is that very fast in the beginning, you've got these 3 creepy ladies showing up and telling Odin, you're going to get killed in Ragnarok. Spoiler alert. And these 3 are supposed to be the Norns. Now, there are in fact 3 Norns that tell Odin this, and they are indeed correctly named and all that kind of stuff. But the Norns are hotties. That's not fair. They're maidens. They're always described in terms of young women. They've got that like virginal sort of like young kind of, but they're like young ladies, and they just hang out in ponds distributing swords. I'm kidding. They don't distribute swords, but they do determine fate. They carve images possibly into Yggdrasil itself, and they determine fate. And fate is a big deal, and it's one of the things that I think a lot of games miss the mark on when it comes to trying to bring across Norse mythology, because in Old Norse culture, and thus in the Norse mythic tradition, fate is immutable. If you're fated to do something, it's going to happen. And it's not like the Greek fates where like, but then you fall into it by act. Like no, that's it. That happens. If you're going to die in a battle, you're going to die in that battle, and you can either hide from it or you can rise to meet it. That's the thing. And if you're a Norse, and indeed any sort of Northern Germanic tradition hero, if you do not rise to meet your fate, especially a grim one, you're not a hero. Like, that is the deal, man. So, we've got the Norns and fate, but in this, the Norns show up, and Odin is really cagey, and I see this over and over again, and it kind of grinds my gears every time. Odin is like, how can I get out of this? And I'm like, you messed up. So, but if you want the academic attestations here, we've got, thence come the maidens, mighty in wisdom, laws they made there, and life allotted to the sons of men and set their fates. By the way, it applies to women too, it's just a linguistic problem. And that's in Voluspa. But I think the best one is from Gruppespa, stanza 53, which is Munat sculpum vina, which I apologize for that pronunciation. That was awful, and I know you all caught me on that. Munat sculpum vina, which just means one cannot overcome fate, or one can't go against that which is set for you. And even Odin himself, while disguised as an old man, which he does often, said, I'd defend my life from such as you are, unless I were doomed, which implies that he wouldn't even defend himself if he knew that it was an inevitability. So a lot of people have kind of gone back and forth, next slide please, over the idea of, so Odin has 2 major things that he is always up to, and one of them is finding knowledge, and the other one is preparing for Ragnarok. And oftentimes these things are connected in the idea that he is gathering knowledge to try to avoid his death at Ragnarok, which is a reasonable assumption, and it's a very logical one, especially from a modern mindset. We hate fate. We're like, yeah, you fight the power. You don't tell anybody what you can do. You reach for whatever might even be possibly possible, and you carry on no matter what. But that's an extremely modern take on it. And part of it kind of comes together with this idea that, like, if he's gathering knowledge for this, but if he's gathering knowledge, does that have to be to avoid his fate? Or is he gathering knowledge to ascertain his fate and rise to meet it? And if he's going to die in Ragnarok, a mighty battle that takes place across all kinds of space and involves so many people and represents the end of the world, in fact is supposed to be the literal end of the world, why not make it a banger? Why not go out in a way that would be remembered throughout time and history forever. So there is that. And so you got Odin and Fenrir. Odin is portrayed half the time as being like just the main character because they're supposed to take the place of Odin. But the rest of the time he shows up as this old man in a blue-gray cloak carrying Gungnir, his spear, which is how he's often depicted. In fact, in a Norse or a Nordic myth, if you read something and a guy shows up and he's got like a cloak and a hat and one eye, it's Odin every time. Sometimes people recognize him. Most of the time people are like, who's that weird guy? I'm going to have to tighten this up a little bit, but there's also some craziness where like often Odin is referred to as the Allfather, but that's kind of misleading. It's more like the shepherd of men or shepherd of things. Specifically, it means all-guider or all-arranger. And then Fenrir is one of Loki's kids. No particular explanation as to exactly how that came about, but it happened. And Fenrir grew super huge, and there's some interesting myths about that. Does okay. He's portrayed as being pretty huge in the game, which is pretty cool. So, all right, but we have got one more big one to go. God of War Ragnarok. Whew. Man, I'm sorry. I tried to fit like 3 hours of stuff into this, so I apologize if this is like a fire hose of information, but I hope you're enjoying it. Okay. So, God of War Ragnarok. I have to admit, I did not play this game. I have a finite amount of time and a finite amount of money and a finite amount of patience for God of War games. I like the first one. But God of War Ragnarok, so I did watch all of the, I watched the whole game on YouTube. So if I get something wrong, I apologize. I must have missed it or fallen asleep because I was not impressed. So the general idea behind God of War, in case you're not sure, is that you've got this guy named Kratos who has some serious anger management issues, and he takes them out on every pantheon he comes across, starting with the Greeks and kind of working his way north. One of the things I don't like about this is because, as you may already guess, Odin tries to dodge his destiny, and I don't like it. But what I really don't like is that they kind of missed a great chance to have an entire pantheon where they believed that fate was immutable, and then you have Kratos, who is the definition of changing fate. And what a wrecking ball he would be to just everything in it. But I know, you introduced the Norse gods in the previous game. You're kind of worked into a corner. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying I felt like it was kind of a missed opportunity. I thought it'd be pretty cool. But sure enough, you've got Odin, who's kind of like this Weasley guy who's trying to dodge his destiny. And truth be told, Odin can be a little Weasley. It does feature Mimir's head. Mimir is the head of a wise guy that Odin sacrificed an eye to, and to oversimplify things quite a bit. But he does show up, and they do feature dwarves, but they're all like short fantasy dwarves. It felt like Dungeons and Dragons. Next page. Carrying on, we've got Thor and Loki. Yeah, the two guys you definitely wanted to hear about because they're the coolest, right? They're played by Chris Hemsworth and Tom Holland. I'm never going to stop making that joke because I love thinking about Tom Holland. You're right, it's Tom Hiddleston. They're both great. So Thor in God of War Ragnarok is portrayed as he's kind of portrayed as like a washed up, like drunk. But Thor indeed, Thor has like kind of like this thing where people think of Thor as a dope, as a meathead, but he's not. In all of the myths, he's actually fairly clever, and while he is tricked at one point, he is that same story, the person who tricks Thor tricks Loki just as easily. So Thor is routinely, he's maybe not a genius, but he is crafty, he's always strong, and he's always brave, and he is described as being extremely hot-headed. But he's also described as being very quick to come down. So quick to anger, quick to come down. There's no real description about him. There are a few attestations that go back and forth about the color of his hair, but due to the confusion of color over time, it's either red or gold or blonde or red gold or strawberry blonde. But one thing that is always mentioned is his eyes. His eyes are frequently described as being blazing or fiery. It's a little unclear if they mean literally on fire. Maybe. Pretty badass. Or just like that they're that intense. Which is why I'm kind of sad that most of the time in God of War Ragnarok he had his eyes closed. Or squinty. He also, this was so weird, but this does happen in the game. Whenever Thor's name is intoned, he shows up. He doesn't necessarily teleport, but like people are like, I wish Thor were here, or like, you wouldn't talk like that if Thor were here, and who should arrive at the moment? Every time. He also always catches Loki instantly. No explanation. It's like nobody could catch Loki, so they said, you wouldn't get away with this if Thor were here, and Thor caught Loki. That happens like 3 or 4 times in that style. Like, it's just, that's what he does. It's superpower. And then you have Loki. He's Odin's blood brother, Fenrir's father. Honestly, Loki's called a trickster, but he doesn't really play a lot of tricks in the sense that we think. He's not mischievous. He's just a liar and a jerk most of the time. But there may have been a period of time where he was like demonized. So it's kind of hard to say. In some cases, he seems more like kind of the underdog where the others kind of like blame him for everything. But a lot of the times he does kind of make things worse for for people. And he's totally responsible for Baldur's death, I tell you. Okay. That sound means that I am already out of time. Next slide. Honorable mentions Heimdall as being the first one that I could find, which was for the Amiga in 1991. The Age of Mythology also gets a quick shout out for, I think, making Norse mythology really accessible to a bunch of people, especially me when I was in college. Next slide. Thank you very much. My name has been Captain Mike. I can be reached at captainmike@captainmike.net.